Fight fans, what an unbelievable night it was at UFC 268. This is the post-fight reaction show. I'm Ryan Thomas. Thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with me this fine morning. Beautiful, beautiful Wednesday morning in Western New York. You're not tuning in live. You're tuning in pre-recorded. If I said live, I'm so used to doing this show live, but I wasn't able to do that today. I have a lot of things to do later in the day, appointments to make and stuff like that, appointments to attend and things of that nature. So I am hopping on here pre-recorded, giving you my UFC 268 post-fight reaction video, my post-fight reaction show. I love to recap the fights, especially when a night of fights is as good as UFC 268 was. A phenomenal night of fights. A night of fights that was as advertised in terms of how it lived up to the expectations. Usman, Covington, the rematch was a phenomenal fight. Rose and Weili was a phenomenal fight, as well as, of course, one of the best fights I've seen in recent memory, an all-out war between Justin Gaethje and Michael Chandler. I will be here, right now, recapping those three fights and some of the other fights that stood out to me on UFC 268. I was able to attend this card, not live, of course. I was able to watch it in a movie theater, and that was a really cool experience. It made the card better. Dare I say it made the card even better. And I'm looking forward to doing that again. I think going to a bar is fun for the fights, of course. Having some drinks around some good company is always a good time. But I really liked being able to kick back in a leather reclining chair and watch the fights from a movie theater. So I'll be doing that again for sure. So first off, what a night of fights. As I said from the top, this was a classic night. Anytime you have three fights that are this massive for each division, whether it be the lightweight division in the case of Gaethje and Chandler, whether it be Rose Namajunas and Weili for the title, or Kamaru Usman and Covington for the welterweight title. I love the fact that we got to see a card this stacked. Frankie Edgar and Chito Vera, Billy Q from One Buffalo against Shane Burgos was a phenomenal fight. But let's get right to it in terms of recapping the action. I want to recap the first fight of the night, which was Justin Gaethje and Michael Chandler. And this fight between Gaethje and Chandler was without a doubt a number one contender fight. Whoever won this fight will face the winner of Charles Oliveira and Dustin Poirier, which that fight takes place next month, few weeks, December 11th, for the UFC Lightweight Championship. Justin Gaethje and Chandler knew what was at stake. They knew that with a win, they're right back in the title contention. With a loss, you're on the outside looking in of a title shot. And Justin Gaethje is, for sure, the new number one contender with a unanimous decision victory over Michael Chandler. And Gaethje fought his fight. There were moments where Gaethje had some trials and tribulations throughout the fight, of course. It was back and forth. But Michael Chandler is as tough as nails. Justin Gaethje is as tough as nails. And it was just the perfect fight for both of these guys. The fight was as advertised. And I loved the fact that you saw Justin Gaethje really bite down on his mouthpiece and get this victory, a victory that he desperately needed to get back into title contention, and a victory that I'm happy he was able to achieve and attain. With that being said, we know what's next for Justin Gaethje. We don't know what's next for Michael Chandler. Michael Chandler drops two straight, one to Charles Oliveira and one to Justin Gaethje. It's not like Michael Chandler's been given the easiest level of competition in his UFC career. He fights Dan Hooker. He gets that win. Fights Charles Oliveira for the UFC lightweight title. He comes up short. And oddly enough, the Chandler versus Oliveira fight and the Chandler versus Gaethje fight were very similar in the sense that both fights Chandler had both men hurt early and often in the first round, and he was just unable to close the distance and finish the competition. And that has to be a tough pill for Michael Chandler to swallow, because now Chandler is on the outside looking in. But Michael Chandler understands the situation of his career more than just about anybody. And coming off of a loss like that, a loss that is just a flat-out, all-out war, Michael Chandler comes out and says, moments after the fight via Twitter, 2022 with a photo of Chandler facing off with McGregor. That was obviously an edited photo, but kind of paints the picture of what it would look like if McGregor and Chandler were able to face off against one another. And I could not agree more with Michael Chandler that the perfect fight for Conor McGregor's comeback, as well as Michael Chandler's comeback, because I think Chandler is going to take some time off, as he should, is Chandler versus McGregor, or McGregor versus Chandler, however you want to look at it. This is the right fight to make for both fighters at the perfect time. And it's an opponent that if Chandler gets a win over Conor, it definitely boosts him right back into title contention. And if Conor gets a win over Chandler, it puts him right back in the thick of things. So it's a great opponent for both men. Whether we see that next in Conor McGregor's quote-unquote comeback fight remains to be seen. But I do believe that that's a fight that we will see. Whether it's next or at some stage sooner rather than later, we will see these two guys compete against one another at the 155-pound weight class. I've heard from a lot of different sources that Conor McGregor's next opponent could very well be Nate Diaz in a trilogy fight. I've heard that Conor McGregor desperately wants another shot at Dustin Poirier. I think that will come as well because the trilogy did not become solved necessarily with that last fight between Poirier and McGregor. I think we will see that eventually. But I think Michael Chandler, honestly, could very well be a great next opponent for McGregor as well as Chandler in their comeback. So Michael Chandler, whoever he's got, barking in his ear as far as his management, his representation, they're doing a very good job. He comes up short in this fight with Justin Gaethje. Prior to that, he comes up short against Charles Oliveira for the title. And it's all gravy because he's coming off of 2 straight losses, and he very well might get the biggest payday fight in the sport against Conor McGregor. So power to Michael Chandler for making that happen and throwing that out there, because that's a fight that I never really thought of until he posted it. And I think it's the perfect fight, perfect opportunity for Chandler as well as for McGregor. So I'm all about that. McGregor versus Chandler, I think that's a great fight. Rose Namajunas, Thug Rose versus Zhang Weili. I love watching these two women compete, whether they're fighting one another or not. And the fact that we got a rematch of this fight immediately after the first was a treat to me. I didn't expect it. I didn't expect to see an immediate rematch between Rose and Zhang Weili, but we were able to see it on Saturday night, this past Saturday night. We were able to see a much, much improved Weili Zhang, but Zhang Weili, I always get those mixed up. Weili, will say, was improved. Those first few rounds, it appeared to me as if Weili was going to win this fight. Rose was really struggling in these first few rounds, maintaining a solid distance between herself and Weili. And Rose has the reach advantage, so she wasn't really able to close the distance on that reach. She wasn't really able to create distance within her reach advantage. She was closing the distance too much, and it allowed Weili to land her strikes. It allowed Weili to stay close to Rose when Rose shouldn't have allowed Weili to stay that close to her, maintaining that distance advantage. Oddly enough, the distance advantage started to materialize for Rose, and when it did, it allowed Rose to shoot in for her single leg or her double leg or work the clinch. And as soon as Rose was able to get Weili down, she was able to get Weili down again and again and again. And those takedowns, that ability to maintain the top position that she was able to maintain throughout the fight, was largely what led her to victory in split decision fashion, retaining her title against Weili Zhang Weili. I love watching these two women compete. I believe that this isn't the last of us seeing these two women share the octagon with one another, and that excites me. But we have to say what is next for Rose and Weili. I think what is next for Rose should be a fight with Carla Esparza. I thought that's what would be next for Rose, coming off of this win to win the title off of Weili. But the UFC wanted to give Weili a second crack at it, coming off of a moment in time where she was caught. She wasn't exactly allowed to initiate her game plan, show much of anything in that fight because it ended so quickly, the first fight between Rose and Weili. And truthfully, I feel that Weili has to get a new opponent to go back to the drawing board, so to speak. An opponent that jumps out at me is Joanna Jędrzejczyk. That title fight was very close between the two of them. Weili was able to get that victory, but that's a rematch. That's a fight of the year contender from the first fight that could very well produce fireworks, and Joanna is without an opponent. And I think that that would be a fun rematch to see. Rose Namajunas versus Carla Esparza, I think will be the next fight for us to see for Rose. It's a challenge for Rose because Carla Esparza is well-rounded. She's got a great ground game. She can strike. I think Rose is the better striker out of the two, but that's a title fight that I think is fair and right for this division. Carla Esparza, former champ in her own right. There's some backstory there because Esparza and Rose fought on the Ultimate Fighter finale to crown the first strawweight champion, and Rose came up short. So now Rose is the champ. Carla's the contender. You see where I'm going with this? I think Rose versus Carla Esparza should be next for Rose Namajunas and for that title fight. Last and certainly not least, in this UFC 268 post-fight reaction show, this is the Kamaru Usman versus Colby Covington 2 recap portion of the show, recapping the main event of the evening. The UFC welterweight title was on the line Saturday night as champion Kamaru Usman looked to defend his title against his rival and number one contender Colby Covington. And we looked at that first fight in depth on the show together. You guys tuned in. You guys heard my take on the first fight. What allowed Usman to essentially take control of the first fight was the fact that Colby Covington and Kamaru Usman mutually agreed, whether they spoke it to one another or not. As the first fight progressed, they mutually agreed that they were just going to stand and bang and stand and trade because both have a great wrestling game. Both have the ability to grapple. Both come from wrestling backgrounds. Colby Covington, a Division I wrestler. Kamaru Usman, a Division II national champion. Colby Covington, a D1 All-American. So you thought that that's what we would see in the first fight, or you thought that that's what we would see in the first fight, but it didn't transpire. They mutually agreed to just stand and trade. Well, this time around, Colby Covington knew that he had to go in there with a little bit of a different game plan. He wasn't going to go in there, fight this slobber knocker fight, because he lost fighting that way the first time around against Usman. But as Covington tried to take Usman down early on in the fight, it allowed Usman to land more shots from a vulnerable position in the case of Colby Covington. Colby Covington shooting in on these takedowns, Usman sprawling and defending the takedown, put Covington in a vulnerable position to eat shots that he didn't eat in the first fight as early on as he did in the second fight. So as the fight progressed, in my opinion, from what I saw from my vantage point and recapping the fight, you did have a solid 2 rounds from Kamaru Usman. 2 rounds in, the second round especially, Kamaru Usman dropped Colby Covington multiple times. You come off of that round, going into the third round, saying to yourself, well, heck, if Usman dropped Covington 2 times in the second round, this fight's not going to last much longer. Boy, was I wrong in thinking that and having that assessment of the second round moving forward in the fight. I was extremely wrong. Colby Covington showed up in the third, fourth, and fifth round, biting down on his mouthpiece, knowing that he had everything to lose, knowing that he needed to fight his hardest these next 3 rounds of the fight, especially in the championship rounds, the fourth and fifth round. And Covington was game from that moment on. Dare I say it, he won those next 2 rounds, the third and fourth. And I had this fight tied going into the fifth and final round with 2 rounds to Usman, the first and second, and the third and fourth going to Covington. Call me crazy, but that's just how I had it shaken up. And I had Usman winning that fifth round. So 3 rounds to 2 for Usman in this rematch. A very close fight. And without a doubt, Dana White, UFC President Dana White said it best. If you didn't have Kamaru Usman in the division, Colby Covington would be the champion of the UFC welterweight division. But Kamaru Usman is for real. He's probably the best pound-for-pound fighter on planet Earth right now. He's coming off of these amazing wins. He's not just as a title holder, as a fighter. 15 straight wins inside the UFC octagon. There is that discussion as to whether or not Kamaru Usman is the elite of the elite, one of the best of all time, the best of all time as a welterweight. Hold the phone on that. I know who the welterweight GOAT is. It's George St. Pierre, still to this day, the welterweight GOAT. Kamaru Usman, no doubt about it, is paving his own road, carving his own path, whatever analogy you want to use. The record of fighting 15 straight, wins, some of them, most of them in the UFC, an undefeated UFC record. That's something that is elite of the elite. That's something that, he's one fight away from tying Anderson Silva for the most consecutive wins in the UFC. So that is really something special. I think Usman is cementing his own legacy in the welterweight division. He's almost cleaned out the division. He's beat Masvidal twice. He's beat Covington twice. What he has done has been nothing short of remarkable. I just can't rate him ahead of George St. Pierre just yet, especially when George St. Pierre, in my opinion, is the best of all time. So with that being said, who do I have next for Usman? This is very tough to decide what is next for Kamaru Usman. It's even tougher to decide what is next for Colby Covington, because both of these guys are the Ali and Frazier of the welterweight division. Usman, I feel, has to fight a fresh opponent coming off of this fight against Covington. The UFC puts together Vicente Luque as an alternate for this fight. He has to make weight in order to be considered an alternate, and Vicente Luque misses weight. So to me, that takes Vicente Luque completely out of the title picture. The fact that you are asked to be an alternate for a fight, the only job you have is to make weight, to be considered as an alternate, and you completely screw everyone over by putting yourself in this position of not making weight. Colby Covington is out of the title picture now with 2 straight losses, not 2 straight, but 2 out of his last 3 fights. 2 losses to Usman, right? Gilbert Burns lost to Usman. Leon Edwards fought Usman a long time ago and lost to him. Vicente Luque missed weight as an alternate. I just talked about that. Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, he's coming off of a loss to Gilbert Burns. That makes 0 sense. The only man that makes sense is Leon Edwards, and Leon Edwards is taking on Jorge Masvidal. I think Leon Edwards is going to win that fight, and it would put Leon Edwards as the number 1 contender, and Masvidal will be the loser of that fight, being that he's fighting Jorge Masvidal on December 11th. Masvidal versus Covington is a fight that everyone wants to see. Both fighters will be coming off losses to fight one another in the lead up to fight one another. So for the sake of the UFC welterweight division, I would hope that Leon Edwards gets past Masvidal. If he doesn't, and if Masvidal gets past Edwards, you're going to put Masvidal in there again versus Usman when he's lost to him twice? That's a tough sell. So it would make things much, much tougher for Usman, for the UFC, for the welterweight division. Kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Leon Edwards has to beat Masvidal in order to fight for that title against Usman, and then Covington would then fight Masvidal. So there you have it. That is my UFC 268 post-fight reaction show. Wrapping things up here, recapping the 3 big fights on the card. I want to give a shout out to Billy Q, Billy Quarantillo from the 716 from Buffalo. Billy Quarantillo was phenomenal in his fight with Shane Burgos. Much respect to him. He proved in this fight, albeit it'll go down as a loss on his record, but he proved to me and to millions that watched the fight card on Saturday night that he belongs in the UFC. And I see a bright, bright future for him. Going toe-to-toe with Shane Burgos was no joke. And it raised his stock as a fighter. Coming up, even though he came up short, it raised his stock anyway. So shout out to Billy Q. Keep representing the 716. We love you. We're rooting for you. And I'm looking forward to seeing who's next for Billy Q in the UFC. I'm Ryan Thomas. Of course, that is the Thomas Take Sports Podcast, UFC 268 post-fight reaction show. Thank you so much for tuning into the show, everybody. I'll be back for more UFC MMA coverage as well as boxing coverage. Of course, covering the Buffalo Bills each and every football season. Pre-game shows, post-game shows, right here on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Enjoy the shows.